It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things.
There are musicians who leave fingerprints on an era, and then there are musicians who reshape the instrument itself. Eddie Van Halen was the latter. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already done something that guitarists spend entire lifetimes chasing. He made the electric guitar sound like it had never sounded before. Two-handed tapping, harmonics that screamed like living things, a tone so distinctly his own that engineers spent decades trying to reverse engineer it. He called it the Brown sound. Nobody else could quite find it. But genius doesn't exist in a vacuum, and neither does frustration. Behind the infectious grin and the party-ready image of Van Halen, Eddie carried a complicated emotional life as a musician. He loved the guitar with a purity that bordered on spiritual devotion, and that same devotion made him deeply sensitive to the people around him. The heroes who inspired him, the peers who dismissed him, and the rivals who threatened the very identity he had fought so hard to build. Over the course of his career, 6 guitarists in particular occupied a space in Eddie's mind that went well beyond simple rivalry. These were relationships marked by admiration, betrayal, cold silences, and in some cases, a wound that never fully healed. This is the story of those 6 guitarists, told honestly, told completely. Long before Eddie Van Halen was a household name, before the sold-out arenas and the magazine covers, he was a kid in Pasadena spending his evenings hunched over cheap guitar trying to decode the magic of Eric Clapton. Cream records were on constant rotation in his bedroom. He would lift the needle, replay passages, slow things down, and try to understand what made Clapton's playing feel so emotionally charged. It wasn't just technique he was chasing, it was a feeling, a language, something that seemed to communicate directly to the chest rather than the ears. Eddie has spoken about this period with genuine reverence. Clapton was, in his own words, the reason he picked up the guitar in the first place. He studied every bend, every pause, every moment where Clapton let the silence do the talking. That kind of influence doesn't just shape a player's style, it shapes their soul. For Eddie, Clapton wasn't simply a guitarist to admire. He was a foundational reason to exist as a musician at all. Which makes what happened next all the more painful. By the late 1970s, Eddie had released something the world wasn't prepared for. The solo eruption, clocking in at under 2 minutes on Van Halen's debut album, detonated across the guitar world like nothing before it. Players who had spent years mastering conventional techniques suddenly felt the ground shift beneath them. This was something new, something untamed, something that didn't follow any previously existing rulebook. Eddie had taken everything he'd absorbed from his heroes and synthesized it into a sound that was entirely, unmistakably his own. The old guard, however, wasn't universally impressed. When Eric Clapton was asked about Van Halen's playing in 1980, his response was polite but pointed. He acknowledged Eddie's technical ability but suggested the playing lacked something deeper. Soul, feeling, the emotional core that Clapton considered the true measure of a guitarist. It was the kind of remark that would barely register coming from a stranger, but coming from the man who had been Eddie's guiding star since childhood, it hit like a gut punch. Eddie later admitted the comment genuinely hurt him. He wasn't trying to outshine Clapton or position himself as a superior player. He was carrying Clapton's influence inside him every time he walked on stage. To have that dismissed as technically proficient but emotionally hollow was a specific kind of heartbreak that most people never experience, the rejection of a child by a parent who doesn't recognize their own reflection. What made the dynamic even more complex was the philosophical difference between them. Clapton's entire approach was rooted in blues restraint. He believed in the space between notes, in the power of what you chose not to play. His guitar told stories through understatement. Eddie's playing operated on an entirely different frequency. He believed in freedom, in spontaneity, in using the guitar as a canvas for every sound the human imagination could chase. Neither approach was wrong. But they were genuinely incompatible in terms of aesthetic values, and that incompatibility cut their potential for mutual understanding off at the knees. The two men eventually met in Los Angeles during the mid-1980s. Eddie reportedly approached the encounter with the nervous energy of a fan finally meeting his idol. Clapton was polite, but the warmth Eddie had hoped for wasn't there. They talked about gear, about amplifiers, about the technical architecture of tone. But the emotional conversation never happened. Afterward, Eddie reflected that he had perhaps been in love with the myth of Clapton more than the man himself. It was a mature observation, and a quietly devastating one. Still, the admiration never fully died. Even in later years, Eddie would reference the old Cream recordings with undiminished wonder. He understood, ultimately, that where Clapton painted with blues and shadow, he himself had painted with neon. Two entirely different artistic visions, neither cancelling the other out. What remained was gratitude, complicated, bittersweet, but real. If Clapton was Eddie's earliest guitar hero, Ritchie Blackmore was the one who made him feel like guitar could be genuinely dangerous. There was something ferocious and theatrical about Blackmore's playing. The classical influences woven through hard rock architecture, the controlled aggression, the sense that every note was being deployed with deliberate, almost military precision. Eddie studied Blackmore's work with Deep Purple obsessively, wearing down the grooves of records trying to understand how a guitarist could sound simultaneously disciplined and ferocious. When Van Halen exploded onto the scene in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself sharing professional spaces with the men he had once worshipped from afar. That transition, from devoted fan to peer, is one of the most psychologically loaded experiences a musician can have. For most people, meeting your heroes is either transcendent or deeply disillusioning. For Eddie, meeting Ritchie Blackmore landed heavily in the second category. The encounter was simple and stinging in equal measure. Blackmore, by all accounts, looked straight through him. No acknowledgement, no handshake, no recognition that the young man standing before him had just released a record that was reshaping rock guitar in real time. Just a cold, empty stare and a turn of the shoulder. For someone as genuinely open and warm as Eddie Van Halen, a man who would happily spend hours talking to anyone about pickups and wiring and tone, that kind of deliberate dismissal was genuinely wounding. Eddie referenced this experience more than once in interviews across the years. He wasn't bitter exactly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that players like Blackmore viewed him as a threat rather than a colleague. The old guard, he sensed, was circling the wagons. They had built their reputations on a certain understanding of what guitar mastery looked like, and Eddie's arrival challenged that understanding at a fundamental level. Rather than engage with what he was doing, some of them simply chose to look away. Blackmore's public comments about Eddie were measured but telling. He acknowledged Eddie's technical invention while simultaneously suggesting he played too many notes, a critique that revealed more about the philosophical divide between them than it did about Eddie's actual playing. Blackmore was a man who believed that every note should earn its place. Eddie was a man who believed that the guitar's job was to pour out everything the heart contained. These were not reconcilable positions, but they were both coherent artistic philosophies, and the tension between them was real. What's interesting is how both men eventually softened with time. Eddie, reflecting on the early cold shoulder years later, wondered whether he had perhaps been overly sensitive, or whether Blackmore's aloofness had simply been shyness or discomfort rather than contempt. Blackmore, for his part, eventually acknowledged Eddie's contribution to the guitar world in terms that were genuinely complimentary. 2 decades of distance allowed both men to see each other more clearly than proximity ever had. Joe Perry of Aerosmith represented yet another version of the same wound. By the time Van Halen was touring relentlessly in support of their debut record, Eddie had already absorbed Perry's influence deeply. Aerosmith's guitar work, raw, riff-driven, thick with attitude, had been part of the musical education of an entire generation of rock players, and Eddie was no exception. But on the road, sharing venues and backstage corridors with Perry, the reception was glacial. Eddie later described the experience with a directness that made clear how much it had affected him. The men he'd grown up idolizing would pass him without acknowledgement, without so much as a nod. He interpreted this, rightly or wrongly, as a form of territorial behavior. These were established players who recognized that the landscape was shifting and who responded to that shift by closing off rather than reaching out. The irony was profound. Eddie hadn't arrived in the rock world looking to displace anyone. He was there because he loved music with an almost childlike passion, a passion that never really left him regardless of how famous he became. He played guitar because playing guitar was the most joyful thing he knew how to do. The idea that this joy could be perceived as a threat by the very people who had inspired it in the first place was genuinely bewildering to him. What he drew from the experience was a kind of self-sufficient resolve. He stopped needing the approval of people who weren't willing to give it. He turned his energy inward, toward invention, toward the next sound, the next modification to his hand-built guitars, the next tone no one had ever chased before. The closed doors of the old guard became, in a strange way, fuel. Joe Perry eventually reversed his position entirely. Years after those early cold encounters, he spoke about hearing Van Halen's debut album with something close to awe. The recognition that what Eddie was doing was not merely impressive but genuinely revolutionary. It was the kind of belated acknowledgement that arrives too late to erase the original sting but arrives nonetheless, carrying with it a kind of quiet vindication. The Tom Scholz episode is different from the others in that it wasn't rooted in coldness so much as a specific incident that Eddie found genuinely infuriating. The two shared a bill in the late 1970s, with Van Halen performing before Boston, and during Scholz's set, Eddie watched from the side of the stage as the Boston guitarist appeared to replicate his solo, note for note, in front of the same audience that had just watched Eddie perform it. Eddie's reaction was not abstract. He was standing there watching it happen, and the crowd was looking back at him as if to acknowledge the obvious. He was angry in the way that only someone with a deep sense of musical identity can be angry, not because of ego, but because he had built something genuinely original through years of solitary invention and was watching it be appropriated in real time by someone who should have known better. What compounded the frustration was Scholz's personality, which ran almost diametrically counter to Eddie's. Where Eddie was loose, warm, and communal, the kind of musician who would wander the backstage area looking for someone to talk guitars with, Scholz was famously reclusive and private. He arrived, performed with precision, and disappeared. He was a brilliant engineer and a meticulous craftsman, a man with an MIT degree who had built his own recording equipment and designed his own amplification systems. But his emotional remoteness struck Eddie as arrogance, even if it may simply have been the natural disposition of a deeply introverted person. The deeper philosophical conflict between them was about the nature of music itself. Eddie believed, fundamentally, that music had to flow from instinct and feeling. Overthinking, over-engineering, over-calibrating. These things, in his view, stripped music of its life.